News Forum. Today we're going to be discussing the psychological factors that affect people and the actual people who commit violent crimes, such as the political assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan last Monday. With us we have Ivan Zendel, who's the coordinator of the Applied Psychology Center here at Concordia. Thanks for coming into the studio today. It's very odd, people's initial reaction to the attempt on Reagan's life last Monday. It was reactions like, did they get him, or absolute total shock. Is this normal?
Well, I think typical response, especially given the history of that we've had in North America and the world actually over the last 10 or 15 years, is that in one hand, here's another person, another president, another well-known figure has been shot, and at the same time there's a lot of anxiety associated with that. Why did it happen? What does this mean? What are the implications? And so you'll have those two reactions from people. One, it's just another, it just happened in America again, that kind of reaction, and the other being that making a joke almost about it as a way of dealing with that doubt and anxiety.
So people's initial reaction isn't necessarily what they're thinking, you think?
That's right. Often their first their overt, the thing that you see is a way of dealing with that first reaction, is a way of coping with that first reaction. You don't usually see people's first feelings. What you see is their response to that feeling, a way of dealing with that feeling.
We have a whole generation that was almost breastfed on watching political assassinations on TV, whether they were dramatized or actual. Do you think there's a difference in the generations, their reaction, or do you think everyone is?
It's hard to know. There's a certain amount of evidence that suggests that when you see certain acts being performed, that it's possible for some people anyway to increase the likelihood that they'll act out in a similar way. In other words, the media and the repeated and intensive coverage of these kinds of events is in a sense modeling to people how they might go about doing something like that. I think that it only affects a very small minority in that way, but it's conceivable. But it's really hard to tell whether in fact this is detrimental. I think the opposite argument can be made also, is that in fact it discourages people because they see what happens to the people, to the assassin afterwards.
Some people commented that maybe going back to the Kennedy assassination, that Oswald was just another lone kook. Now that we've seen since John Lennon and now Ronald Reagan, just one single person who's obviously disturbed, trying to take a shot at someone.
Mm-hmm. It's hard. Certainly there's some, I think, significant differences between Kennedy's assassination, Lee Harvey Oswald, and Reagan's attempted assassination and John Lennon's death, and that is that the latter two, Hinckley and Chapman, they made no plans for any kind of escape. Chapman, in fact, waited for the police to come. Hinckley did it in such a way that it was inconceivable that he wouldn't be caught. Oswald, on the other hand, seems to have planned the thing much better and, in fact, expected to escape, to get away with it. He left the scene and almost did get away with it.
What goes on in a person like Chapman or Hinckley's mind that they obviously put themselves in that position? Like, they can't be thinking the same things we do when we get up in the morning.
Well, there's two possibilities, and I'm not sure that anybody could ever know what went on in their minds before and during the actual event. The two possibilities are, of course, that on the one hand, they had completely lost touch with any kind of reality. They were, in a sense, living in their own cognitive world, they had a certain logic which we wouldn't understand or would be so obviously foolish to us, and were completely divorced from the reality that we live in. The other possibility, and I think it's reasonable in both these cases, is that in fact they were using their victims as a way of hurting themselves, that they were, in a sense, suicides that unfortunately had to drag somebody else in.
Is society to blame? Because here we have a situation with Hinckley that he had a fascination or an infatuation with a young actress, Jodie Foster, which is total fantasy, but obviously to him it was his life.
Yeah.
And you know, what causes people, what's causing our society to fantasize with unreal figures? And
it's a difficult question.
crimes.
I mean, you know, if you would have seen a film or a clip of a 15-year-old who was in love with Jodie Foster and carried pictures around and put up huge posters in their bedroom, it wouldn't be unusual. I mean, that would be fine, and we would say, isn't that cute, basically. The question I think you're really asking is how much of what happened is because of this particular person's problem, and how much of it was the fact that he was living in a certain environment, which includes, as we talked about before, movies that portray violence, an environment where a person can live many, many years without any kind of social contact and nobody really caring about them. And as long as they're quiet and not doing anything, they'll be basically ignored. An environment where anybody for $47.50, I believe, can pick up a gun that can make them a star.
So we're not really to blame. You can't say society is at fault here. These things are going to happen anyways.
It depends on what you feel your role in society is.
Yeah, 'cause
Or
we're in a
what you feel society's intervention should be. I mean, there are people, for example, the whole gun control thing, which seems to periodically come up after every public or well publicized assassination. On the one hand, they suggest that it doesn't matter if we took away all handguns, you'd still have these, quote, kooks who would go ahead and do this kind of thing, and other people suggest, well, possibly it would still happen once in a while, but you would seriously decrease the probability. And so the question is, how much should society intrude on individuals' lives?
What I'm worried about, we're in a situation around the world now where the political climate is swinging more towards the right. And a lot of people, the moral majority in the States, for example, who wants to restrict the types of television shows that are on and films that are in cinema. And this is a situation where it's an example for them that they're going to bring up and show off to everyone and say, look, this is what happens, when someone watches a movie and they're going to go shoot the president. How,
I think my guess is that individual events like this aren't what change people's minds and don't often create situations where you have a lot of repression. I think the movement towards greater or lesser repression occurs in spite of these things and not so much because of them. Especially in this situation where you can bet that this whole thing will be pretty much forgotten in 3 or 4 days, in 3 or 4 weeks at best.
That's another interesting phenomenon. How we.
Well, I mean, most people have a lot of difficulty remembering the 2 assassination attempts on John Ford. I mean, twice there was an assassination attempt, but neither time were bullets fired, and people don't remember that. It's only when they started pulling out the videotapes now, and people say, "Oh yeah, I remember that." Things like this get forgotten.
So we've become desensitized to these things.
I think so.
Yeah.
And you had mentioned to me, one person's reaction that they'd used the wrong bullet. We had talked about that before. And I think that's part of that also, is that we're so used to seeing this, we're so used to this, to seeing such graphic violence, that when it doesn't happen the way we're used to, there's almost a sense of disappointment. And I don't think on a conscious level, but if it's not really gory, then big deal.
I mean, live happily ever after, so to speak. If the ending's not the way it's supposed to be, people get upset. Do you think that's part of the reaction? It's not that they really hated Reagan, but damn it, he didn't die. Someone shot him, he's supposed to die.
Well, I think, I wouldn't be surprised if there is, in a sense, sort of a sense of disappointment that there was this great big build-up to this event, And what you expect to happen is, for example, Dan Rather being on TV for 8 or 10 hours straight, and really he had nothing to talk about because Reagan was okay. And I don't mean to be perverse about this, but I think there is that aspect to it, that we've seen this so often, that really, if it's not terrible, then it's almost boring.
Well, it's no wonder if you can have a majority of the population thinking that. It's no wonder someone is actually going to go and shoot him. I'm surprised there aren't more. There's more attempts we might not hear about, but more successful attempts.
Yeah.
If that's the way we think, I find that abnormal. But
it's hard to know. I mean, there's obviously a lot of threats that are made to the president, I'm sure to the prime minister, and I'm sure the leader of most countries, that we never hear about except in very unusual circumstances. For example, after Reagan's attempted assassination, the Canadian government announced that they in fact had received various kinds of threats. And so I'm sure this kind of thing goes on all the time. How you would be able to separate the real threats from the crank calls, if you can call it that, is another question.
so right now, what are people thinking? Are we still on the death watch, waiting for the next attempt, and we've resumed our normal lives, and when it happens, we're going to be glued to the set again to watch these events?
Well, I think it would be naive to believe that anybody thinks that this won't happen again. Even Reagan's top aide said, well, this is part of the job. I think 10 years ago, a president might not, or presidential aides might not have acknowledged that. But certainly now it's become an accepted thing that this is just the way it is. And as president, that's a risk that you take. And there's no real attempt to stop it. I mean, they recognize now that they possibly didn't have enough security, at least in the press area. But they're not going to have him in public less. I think quite the contrary. He's going to be out there a lot more to show that he's not afraid.
Okay, well, thanks for coming in this afternoon. And this is CUTV News Forum. This is our last show for the 1980-81 season. Hope you'll join us next September when we resume broadcasting. Thank you very much.
That was fast. That was only about 15 minutes. Oh, we're still on.